Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan. Also joining us is the associate editor of Strategy Page, columnist and author Austin Bay. Welcome, Austin and Jim. Thought we'd return to Ukraine and talk a little bit about what's going on there. We haven't been there for a while. Russia is still involved there. I think, Austin, you sent me something that it's been 6 years since Russia has taken over Crimea. Jim, what is the current situation in Ukraine?
Well, about a year ago, they elected a former president, an actor who's also a lawyer, and that people felt, the experts, the veterans have not done much good, so let's try somebody fresh and new. And in his first year, which is not quite over, I think it's April when he took over, he has indeed, as the old saying goes, democracies always do the right thing, usually after they've exhausted every other possibility. And he went through that list. He tried doing it the nice way. He tried cooperating with his basically dysfunctional deep state, as we call it here in the United States. And he apparently has decided, all right, let's try plan B, which means he's going for structural constitutional reforms in the law, because one of the big problems in going after corruption is that the legal system, which is a mishmash of the Soviet era, we decide the verdict before you go to court, with basically an archaic, non-functional, basically a system where anybody with enough money and basically to bribe people or intimidate can bog down a prosecution forever. So, people are very angry that while a lot of big shots have been indicted, none of them are coming close to being convicted and put away or punished in any way, shape, or form, other than the extra expense and hassle of delaying the court proceedings. But you can hire people to do that. The other problem he has is the economics of Ukraine. That is wound up in the way the assets were distributed after the separation from Russia. He has started the process of basically reprivatizing a lot of still state-owned assets, and doing it in a way that is not going to basically put them in the pockets of the oligarchs, as they're called, at bargain prices. He's aware of all these things. I mean, that's the one thing that keeps his popularity up, although it's gone down from 74% to 49%. But still, considering all his problems, he's still a popular guy, most popular politician in Ukraine, which is not saying much, but he's at the top of that list. He has basically made changes in his own staff. He had a chief of staff who was part of the problem, so he's been replaced with a new guy who has a better pedigree, as it were. We'll see if he's any better in actual action. He's given up on trying to negotiate with Putin, because Putin just basically blows smoke and says, no, you got to legally give me part of the half of Donbass that we've already captured. There's a serious problem in the Donbass in that, Putin keeps his people fighting. Literally, most of the soldiers at the front are either Russian or, Russian military, or guys who have basically accepted, a Russian paycheck and are generally loyal. They have no choice, because Putin went to old Stalin when he started getting pushback from the first few years. The rebels, a lot of them were Donbass residents who said, hey, yeah, let's be independent. Let's play off Russia versus Ukraine and get rich. These guys he had assassinated one by one. As many as necessary until the rest of them fell in line. So not only is he doing that with the local leadership he's installed, but he's replacing a lot of the local officials in his Donbass with Russians. He's basically allowed people to use Russian passports. He's almost insisting on it. He's allowing more Russians to migrate to Donbass because about half the population has left, either fled to Russia or basically went to Ukraine. But at the same time, Putin is recruiting as many people as he can in Donbass to be agents of the secret police and spies, and that is making the Ukraine very angry because they keep arresting a lot of them, but a lot of them don't get arrested. So Ukraine is full of Russian agents, and that irritates people no end, and certainly complicates matters. But so far, Zelensky has been receptive. He's willing to change. He has made a lot of changes, but not the ones that count most with people. I mean, the economy is only growing about 3-4% this year. He promised 7%, but the economy hasn't gone down the tubes. So people still have, hopes that, they voted for the right guy. He's just got to get his act together. At the moment, Putin has got bigger problems. I mean, not only has he acknowledged there's a stalemate in Donbass, he's got a basically disloyal population. He's picked out loyalists. They put in a lot of Russians to try and make sure he has control. There's no rebellion among the rebellion. But at the same time, Putin is losing all over. He's now at war with Turkey in both Syria and Libya. That's ironic. I mean, he's technically an ally with the Turks, but the Russians are killing Turks in Syria as well as Libya. Isn't that a change of pace? The Turks at the same moment are going to war with Europe, which is nothing new. They're threatening to unleash the 3-some-odd million Syrian refugees who he was bribed by the European Union to stay within his borders. So he's unleashing the refugee weapon. And that just adds to the Russian problems because they're getting blamed with this by a lot of Europeans. And in fact, Putin is finally being blamed by a lot of people who gave him except maybe in the United States, for his shenanigans in the past. And it's all coming home to roost. In other words, he's got a lot of debts he can't pay, a lot of problems he can't fix, and new ones are popping up every day. But that doesn't help Ukraine much because it is expensive for Russia to maintain their presence in Ukraine. I mean, that is a not insignificant expense. We're talking billions of dollars a year, and they never got the money. I mean, their economy's anemic. They still have an enormous corruption problem. They still have all the sanctions. The low oil prices, probably more than anything else. It's always the price of oil that's been the curse of Russia in the last century. And that's not getting any better. The corruption within Russia is epic and debilitating. And the Russians are probably more disappointed with Putin than the Ukrainians are with Zelensky. So it's a stalemate with Ukraine making slow but not sufficient progress so far. Zelensky's got a few more years, to turn things around. And if he gets some traction this year, which he's aware of, I mean, let's face it, he is a smart guy. Being a performer, he had a hit TV show about a accidental Ukrainian president. So, I mean, that's another, game within a game. But he is able to get in front of an audience and make his case, succinctly and convincingly. So he has that going for him. And he still has the trust of most Ukrainians. But they want results. Who can blame him? But he's the only hope they got right now. And of course, meanwhile, the corrupt politicians, businessmen, and what have you, they're basically on Russia's side. They say, hey, we'll outwait this little twerp, and we'll get back to the old ways of plundering with impunity without any fear of somebody, spoiling our lucrative operation. Zelensky does also have a problem with what they call the intelligentsia. That's always a problem, especially in Eastern Europe. They look down on him because he's a performer, even though he's a lawyer and obviously a successful politician. Where have we heard that before? But anyway, he he is, like I say, the only hope they've got. The opposition in Ukraine is from minorities, i.e., the corrupt, oligarchs and the corrupt, bureaucracy. That's something can only clear out with the majority of parliament he's got that actually enact those kind of measures. What he wants to avoid, though, is putting so much power in the presidency that he will basically create a Frankenstein monster that in the future will turn on Ukraine. So he's trying to institutionalize the changes. For example, cleaning up the judiciary and the legal processes to make the trials fair but expeditious. Cut out all the BS, really, the nonsense, the just the rules, the massive rules in the legal system currently that allows somebody who's guilty of sin to delay judgment, indefinitely. Somebody in Ukraine's past, read the House of Usher, I believe it was, that classic novel about the lawsuit that goes on perpetually. They can't afford that sort of thing. It's a luxury no country should have to endure. So he's moving in the right direction, not fast enough. One thing he's got going for him is Russia's in worse shape. But again, Putin would lose enormous face if he backed away and returned the stolen parts of Ukraine to Ukraine, and that will take a lot longer.
Austin?
Well, let me make a couple of points, or expand on a couple of points Jim made about Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. Look, the guy really is an intellectual. He's accomplished in several areas. Some of the bias against him that Jim mentioned among so-called intellectuals in Ukraine, I think some of that is jealousy, because just his parents are educated, he's highly educated, and he's got something that his opponents don't have: charisma. He can get on stage too and give an impromptu stand-up comedy routine. He's got he don't connect that immediately to politics. That's just a skill, and one of the hardest things to do in entertainment is stand-up comedy with nothing except your voice, your face, your hands and arms, and the like. There are very few people that really have that talent. Zelensky, and Jim already pointed this out, he understands that corruption saps, damages Ukraine. All right. It's been endemic to vast portions of the world. Politicians graft everywhere. Yeah, I'll mention it. We have it here in the United States through certain kinds of foundations that are really just fronts for laundering money to get it to politicians. But in the lands that were once the Soviet Union, you've got, and Jim touched on this too as well, the phenomenon of the former nomenclatura, KGB, communist operatives just took control of state assets and then continued to operate in the way that they had already were operating, which was they were crooked. And that that didn't change in Ukraine, though. Again, to Ukraine's credit, in 1994, 95, there were reformers. They had another, their what was it, Orange Revolution, I think, 2004, 2000, yes, I think that was the name of it. Another move by reformers. And they were always undermined. And it's not that Russia hasn't had those impulses. Yeltsin had those impulses, but they didn't. There wasn't a significant enough of the activist, politically active populace to advance it. Ukraine has shown signs of that. Those modern square protests that continued and ultimately toppled the pro-Russian regime. It's some of it has to do with their proximity, the Western half's proximity to Poland. They know what Poland has managed to do since the end of the Cold War. Yes, Poland's got its problems. Poland's got corruption, but Poland has also turned its economy around. And they sit there and think, if our neighbors can do it, we can do it as well. Of course, that is an economic virus. There's the democracy virus, to go back to Jim's wisecrack about China fearing Hong Kong's democracy virus. That's a virus that the Russian oligarchs fear, which is, wait a minute, if Poland can do it, well, everybody else in Eastern Europe can do it as well. Now, Dan, I forwarded you and Jim a State Department press statement that I'd gotten in email on February 27th. By the way, we're recording this on February 28th. And that was mentioning the Russian invasion of Crimea, which occurred at the tail end, depending on which day you think the special forces made their first move in Crimea. It was the 24th to 25th of February 2014. And the first announcement of we want to annex Crimea was made on the 27th of February 2014. The official announcement doesn't come till mid-March, when Putin announces the annexation. I think it was March 18th in Red Square. Big hoopla, and he's popular as he can be. He's recovered Crimea from Mother Russia. Of course, in the process, he set off this war, and Jim's already discussed the way it is now. It's draining Russia's already fragile economy. Right now, and Jim, correct me if I'm wrong, even though they've got Russian troops in there, what minimal casualties the pro-Russian forces are taking, it's no longer Russian soldiers doing it, because they got him in trouble. Is that right? That's pretty much the case. He's got
even though they've been controlling the internet, they can't hide funerals. In other words, the old saying goes, you can't hide a dead body.
Yeah.
Unless you were a complete communist state. Well, and you're right. Putin had to recognize that reality, and so he's poured more money, which they haven't got, into recruiting locals and having Russians down there. It's the old KGB routine. The KGB is behind the front lines, ready to execute any traitor. So they're really going old school.
So he's got the a cannon fodder buffer in this. But Dan, I went back maybe 10 minutes before we started the podcast and looked at a column I wrote in 2018 about the violent stagnation in eastern Ukraine. That's really been the case since the fall of 2014. The Russians start their anti-Ukraine war, or war in Ukraine, their pseudo-liberation war in Ukraine, April. By May 2014, it's rolling. And they do make some advances. Ukraine has no real military forces. Ukraine is vulnerable. We have one documented case of a Russian regular army tank unit crossing the border and shooting up one of the few border towns where there had been some resistance, and then went back across the border. I mean, an absolute slam dunk case of a cross-border raid by a regular army force. I forget when that happens during the summer, but it occurred, but then by October of 2014. It's already bogged down. The Ukrainian really National Guards, volunteers, and what small regular forces they have managed to hold in the western part of the Donbass. One of the things that's going on is Poland is supplying on its own, out of its own war reserves, ammunition, small arms, and the like. And very, very, very limited other support from Western Europe and the United States. As a matter of fact, the Obama administration wasn't going to provide any war material. We do begin to supply some food assistance and medical aid, but Poland is providing just enough to the Ukrainians that they managed to hold the line. And one of the big drives, though, that the Russians were trying to do was drive through a town, I'm going to mispronounce it, Mariupol, which is a port on the Sea of Azov, which is that it's an extension of the Black Sea on the eastern side of the Crimean Peninsula. If they could take that, then they get to the neck of the Crimean Peninsula, and they have a land route to Crimea, and they thought that would seal the deal. Never managed to do it, despite bringing in artillery. Yes, there were supposedly Russian or pro-Russian separatist volunteers, but they were manned by Russian army artillerymen, both tube and rocket artillery. Some of the rocket artillery, according to what I read, Jim wrote about it too, seemed to be actually positioned inside Russia, but it had sufficient range to. Some of it was positioned inside Ukraine, but the Russians would say, no, we've just got this set here to defend our own borders. It was absolutely see-through propaganda, but it was something that the Russians primarily directed at their. It was for domestic consumption. So stagnating violence. That's been the case really since the end of 2014, and it continues now, where you had a series. It's almost like a sine wave. Violence would creep up, increase, peak, then lapse again. There would be a peace agreement. There have been 4 or 5 serious or semi-serious attempts to really have a peace agreement, get a ceasefire that works. But typically after every one of the ceasefires, within 3 or 4 days, you'd have reports, mostly coming through Ukraine, but then also from international reporters, that because they could get into Ukraine, of sniping incidents, mortar attacks, someone firing an RPG at a car, and as Jim said, also assassinations. It wasn't just some of the ones that Jim was talking about. Getting rid of the Russians, getting rid of some of the troublemakers on their side. They also targeted and shot some genuine moderate leaders, a couple of mayors in the Ukrainian mayors in the Ukrainian towns that were promoting negotiations, ticking off the Ukrainians, but they were murdered under circumstances that suggested they were killed by Russian operatives. They didn't want somebody that would try to negotiate a deal with the Ukrainians. So there was rampant crime on top of it. What Russia wants now, Jim's touched on that. They want to try to find a way to save face. I wonder how that could possibly be engineered. The Putin's regime, would it survive a withdrawal? I don't think so. Does Russia have any intention of giving back the Crimean Peninsula? And that State Department press release that I sent you and Jim talks about the illegal occupation of Crimea, because the United States never recognized it, nor has Ukraine. Doesn't go into detail on that, but we certainly have on strategy page the Budapest Accords of 1994, were supposed to. That was a deal where Ukraine gave Russia all of its nuclear weapons with guarantees of territorial integrity, and it was co-signed by the United States, Clinton administration, and Great Britain. Now, was it a treaty per se? Not in the legal definition of a treaty, but it was the way it was a shaping document, a fundamental document that brought stability to Eastern Europe, where that had been either parts of the former Soviet Union, Soviet Socialist republics, Ukraine was one, or also in the case some of the other Warsaw Pact nations. And it was, here's the deal. We don't want the nukes, the Ukrainians said, but we want to be assured that we're not going to face a conventional war. And that Putin's government in 2014 just absolutely shredded that, saying we've got the power to move and we're going to move and we're going to take Crimea. Now, are they going to give it back? Jim wrote an update at the end of December 2019 that a large part of that update was about the bridge over the Kerch Strait, Kerch, that connects Russia across the Sea of Azov directly to Crimea. They've got a road. I imagine it's somewhat like a large bridge with an American interstate crossing the Mississippi River, and they don't have to have Mariupol now in order to have a quote unquote land connection to Crimea. Russian government has made a huge deal out of building that bridge. And it providing that connection. So, to get back to how does this end? What's the end game? Jim's also already discussed the population movement of bringing in, allowing Russians to citizens to move into the Donbass. It looks like they've got it, but at the same time, they've created a condition of instability and grievance that's not going to go away for 3 or 4 decades, if even then. And they've also created a condition where, by shredding that 1994 agreement, trading nuclear weapons for territorial security, by doing that, they have opened Pandora's box, not just Pandora's box, for territorial expansion. I mean, some of the things the Chinese have done is, it was May of 2014 when they started beating up on the Vietnamese again on grabbing Vietnamese maritime territory because it had signs of oil and gas. And I started calling it the Crimean precedent. If you do that, you're in a world where that land used to belong to my great grandfather. I want it now. To be fair about this, even though I don't want to be fair to Putin, they point to 1999 in Kosovo and say that's the Kosovo precedent, that NATO stepped in and that internal war with Serbia with its Kosovar Albanians to, quote unquote, prevent a genocide by the Serbs against the Kosovar Albanians. Kosovo is now a separate country. And they said, that's the precedent. There are real differences between what happened in Kosovo and what happened with Crimea and the Donbass in 2014. But the Russian propaganda machine is able to use that as its historical justification. I'll leave it there.
Yeah,
Jim?
this is an old scam. I mean, what started World War II? German claims on territory they had lost after World War One, or territory they never had, like half of Czechoslovakia, where you had a German population. I mean, there was also a German immigrant population from several centuries ago, along the Volga River. At one point the Russians offered Germans, free land, come, like yada yada, and that sort of worked out economically. And after the Cold War ended, the United Germany decided to let these Volga Russians return, which many of them eagerly did because they wanted to get the hell out of Russia. But when they hit Germany, they realized they were Russians. I mean, they had German ancestors, but they had been Russified. Some of them spoke, a very accented form of German. But that's what happens. As the old saying goes, you can't go home again. But this has been a casus belli, a cause for wars, for centuries. We're helping out our countrymen. I mean, this is what the Islamic radicals are talking about. Spain belongs to us. Sure, we lost it 500 years ago, but it's ours. I mean, we stole fair and square, from the post-Roman Empire, Franks. But once we did it, because we're the true religion, it belongs to us. So, I mean, there's any manner of variations to this basic rhetoric, but basically it's right. Might makes right. Sure, we're bullies, but what are you going to do about it? And that's basically one of the problems with peace all over the world. In fact, I did a book back in the 80s called How to Stop a War, and part of it was examining all the wars that had occurred in the previous 200 years. And we had this big chart, which is still valid, we found out that the primary cause, the most common cause of wars in that two-century period was real estate. People wanted land. Whether they really were entitled to it or not, that started the fighting. And the war usually ends up costing a lot more than whatever you gained from it. But there it is, and it's playing itself out in Eastern Europe as expected. After the Soviet Union, all the communist countries collapsed, because a lot of them, most spectacularly in Yugoslavia, were basically multi-ethnic states where the sense of nationalism among the different ethnicities was still very strong. And you needed basically a totalitarian police state, which is one thing the communists perfected, nothing else, to basically suppress, but they couldn't destroy, that nationalism. And as soon as the communist government was gone, the politicians started to invoke, our people and our land. And you had, throughout the 90s, you had the fighting going on in Yugoslavia. As Austin points out, it was different. It's not like Ukraine. I mean, the Ukrainians voted, as it were, even the ones in Donbass, to get out of the Soviet Union. They didn't want to be part of the empire anymore. But the empire never forgets. And now the empire's coming back for you. Same thing with China. I mean, I pointed this out years ago. I might have even mentioned it in one of the, Quick and Dirty Guide to Wars books, that if you look at the ethnic map of China, you'll find China is surrounded by smaller ethnicities, outside of China. Many of them are ethnic Chinese who fled the empire. In other words, the only choice you have when the empire comes your way is to move, to go. That's why America has this isolationist tradition. United States, except for the original, American Indian population, which was decimated, long before the colonists came here. People don't realize this. They talk about, the diseases killing all the Indians. Yeah, but the truth is in the detail. If you go back and read the tales, the accounts of the colonists, most of the Indians died off before the massive colonists got there. It only took a few. I mean, if the Vikings had brought some people with smallpox with them and measles, which generally didn't survive, open ocean voyages in those ships of theirs, the Indian population in the Americas might have been immunized or had as much immunity as the Europeans when the great mass of Europeans, showed up, and history might have been quite different. But what if, that's just fiction, not reality. But what is reality is exploding nationalism. That's why a lot of Americans are upset with all this, multiculturalism. There's no such thing, politically as multiculturalism. You're simply, tearing your country. If you've got a country that has made peace with multiple cultures, and there are a handful, Swiss did it, becoming, basically tremendously affluent and having a nation in arms. Every adult male keeps an assault rifle at home. Everybody basically has to stand to if there's a war, and they stayed out of war for 2 centuries. So that's how they did it. Belgium is still a work in progress. Canada still has a problem with the French. They said, all right, you don't have to be absorbed, and that just means the Francophone politicians in Quebec have a license to raise the separate state flag anytime they're in big trouble or feeling particularly adventurous. That's one of the fundamental issues that a lot of politicians don't want to admit in the United States. The uncontrolled immigration, as well as an educational system that basically puts emphasis on grievances and ethnic differences and not on becoming an American who gets along with everybody. We tend to forget our successes and concentrate on real or imagined problems. But in any country that was titled like the United States, Canada, not as much as the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and what have you, they basically eventually come around and saying, look, you got to become an Australian. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. The Europeans are doing the same thing. They're now making it mandatory. If you want to be a permanent citizen of Netherlands, you got to learn to speak Dutch. You got to learn to obey our laws. You got to basically learn to at least pretend to be a Dutchman. Even the Germans are coming with that, which is ironic because, like most European countries, Germany had a law, and most other European countries do it, where citizenship is based on what they call blood. The Nazis made that look real bad, which it often is. But basically, there is no birthright citizenship. It's very difficult to become a citizen. In Japan, it's almost impossible. In fact, the most racist countries on the planet are East Asians, but that's a whole other story. We tend to forget how important a role that plays in a lot of the unrest around the world. We pointed out in Strategy Page because when you dig down to any war going on anywhere, it's basically ethnicity or real estate or the two combined. And so, that's very, it's there right in front of you, but a lot of people don't like to admit it because basically it's messy. It's much easier to sit back and invent other reasons and other solutions, which, are basically more profitable and less of a problem to deal with. And so, it's not just a problem for Ukraine, it's a problem for the world. Some countries are just better at dealing with it, than others.
Look, the ethnicity, too. I think this is worth making a point on. There's also an elastic notion of ethnicity, but other differences come into play. And here I'm thinking about Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, where they're really all Southern Slavs, Serbs, yeah. But Croats are Catholics, and they use Latin script. Serbs are Orthodox, and they use Cyrillic. And Bosnians, the Bosniaks are Muslims, and but they're all really one ethnic group. You wouldn't know that, given the enmity about it. But
that is stoked by politicians. When all these ethnicities come to the United States, they get along.
Yeah,
partially because they haven't got a choice, but to a large extent because they haven't got their own country ethnic politicians, coming in and saying, "Oh, they're oppressing, us Bosnians in Chicago. We must do something." To arms doesn't work.
Well,
but you got a lot of American intellectuals, whatever you want to call them, and say, "Yeah, sure, let's have a let's have a little Europe of the United States. Well, good luck with that.
We've seen that happen since the Yugoslav War of Devolution here in the United States. Even here in Texas, where there's some Bosniaks, more Bosniak refugees that I'm aware of were resettled, but there were also Serbs and some Croats, and heck, they all basically speak, I know, Serbo-Croat, but Serbian are dead, and they get along fine in places like, Houston really is a multi-ethnic city, but it's got the pressure on it there of, the economic opportunity is something that erases a lot of these barriers. And Jim, you already mentioned that with one of the Switzerland successes, let's get rich. And their other requirement, which is everybody's got to defend the state. We don't have that here in the United States anymore, but you still have a chance to get rich. And as that's something that let's leave the. This gets back to what your point earlier, Jim, about coming to the U.S. Let's leave those old divisions behind. Sometimes it's hard to do, and then we do, unfortunately, have our own politicians here who mine grievances, because what it does is it gives them a passionate edge, they think, in an election, and that's.
Well,
does that ultimately lead to bloodshed? It could. I'm not saying. I don't believe that's going.
Well, there's two things going on here. One, people misunderstand why people came to America. They came to America mainly to survive. People don't like to leave their homeland. I mean, that's general, and most people don't. But like the Eastern European Jews, the anti-Semitism had reached pretty much, scary proportions. So for a lot of them, especially before World War II, get out or die. Now you die slowly, before, the 19th century. The pogrom may or may not get at you, but people just don't like to live under that kind of pressure. And they hear stories about it. You go to America, they won't kill you for being a Jew. Well, maybe in some parts of the country they will, but and you had economic freedom. I mean, the streets weren't paved with gold, but they were paved with opportunity. And people basically got rich, so to speak, first relatively to the old world, but then they realized, hey, I can vote. And the laws are fairly, enforced, in this country compared to the old country. But Americans tend to forget that. And, that's why the recent immigrant has an economic advantage, because they're hungry. They've been operating under a huge load, as it were, back in the old country, and suddenly they hear they're free to, go, and they go. But then the kids grow up and they say, oh, geez, I don't have to go to work after school when I'm 14 years old, or work full time when I'm 14. I can basically goof around. I can go to college, and of course the government conveniently gave them an opportunity to go heavily into debt, so they really couldn't prosper as their parents have, and nobody wants to admit how that worked out. It was a great political plan, and it made a lot of colleges rich, because basically they got into an arms race, knowing that the kids could just take on bigger loans, they get paid, and they just created this huge infrastructure in the colleges, which were less about teaching and more about having more highly paid college employees, most of them not instructors. So you see how Thomas Jefferson, he saw this. He pointed out you need a revolution every 20 years, and basically he wasn't talking about burn the place down revolution. He was talking about chuck the bums out revolution.
Yeah. Oh no, that's exactly right. Jefferson was not advocating going around shooting your fellow citizens.
But he understood the role of corruption.
Yep.
It was going on in England, and England, for example, is one of those states that periodically purges itself. We do it, not frequently enough, but it happens. But the entrenched interests, as it were, the people who are making money off the non-productive ways of doing government, or the counterproductive, they say, well, no, come on, man. We got a good thing going here. That's a refrain I've heard from people tempting where they go to work for a nonprofit or a government organization, and they're basically eager beavers, and somebody pulls them aside and says, hey, look, don't be so enthusiastic. It makes us look bad. I mean, I heard that again and again. And, anybody who's tried to do business with the government face-to-face, like getting your license renewed, gets reminded of that periodically.
Well, look, just to bring this back to the point I made earlier about Ukraine, because we're starting to run long. I'm just looking at the time up here. There were reformers in Ukraine as soon as the Soviet Union broke up that knew something about some of the possibilities of where democracy could go. They got squelched, they got undermined. Some of it, I think, it was due to, especially in the late 90s, to Russian finagling. And after the Orange Revolution, I think the Orange Revolution scared Putin very much. The thing is that why did they move in 2014? I think they thought they could get away with it. They didn't get away with it. And one other thing we ought to point out, too, geostrategically, you've got probably majorities in Sweden and Finland of the voting age adults who would just as soon join NATO. And for all practical purposes, they have, and without doing it overtly, given all the military exercises in the Baltic area that involve NATO, so-called bilaterally or trilaterally with Sweden and Finland. And if you don't think that is a blowback to the Kremlin, it's a heavy-duty blowback.
Yeah, there's something else we get out of all this, which again we pointed out in the strategy page, is empires that still exist that haven't been torn to pieces, like the German Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but the Turkish Empire. That's why they jokingly call Erdogan Sultan Erdogan the First. And
they call him Sultan Recep because the Sultan gets called by his first name.
Okay, Sultan. But anyway, he is basically doing that and doing it very badly, and so hopefully that'll end poorly for him, and they'll return to their Ataturk days. But you see it happening in Iran, where half the current population is not ethnic Iranian, and they want to expand that. China was always an empire. They fell on hard times when they didn't keep up with technology and political changes, and they're still suffering from that. And of course the current Chinese communist dynasty, as it were. Let's call it what it is.
No, that is. China's an emperor.
Exactly. And a lot of people, and one mistake, as it were, one good thing the Chinese did to get them out of the mess they created with the adopting communism, which killed 40, 50 million Chinese. Nobody pays attention. But anyway, they Chinese, remember, was that, all right, it's good to get rich. That was Deng in the 80s. But not realizing or not basically taking into account how important that would be to the political future of China, because when you got all those middle class and wealthier Chinese, running an empire becomes a lot more difficult.
Well, they want to go to Hawaii or London and
well, not only that, but they want to say and what happens, and that's why I think a lot of pundits are saying with some accuracy that the coronavirus may be the final blow to the communist, the Maoist the dynasty, because that's always in the past. That's what brought about major revolutions in China. Now it just replaced one dynasty with another, but it was usually a nationwide disaster that the emperor, who was supposed to be the anointed of God, whether it be Karl Marx or the Celestial Kingdom, demonstrated that they did not have the mandate of heaven. They were basically failures, and so we needed something new. And of course, what the Chinese communists are worried about, the next thing new, is let's be all like Hong Kong, and people were saying that in Guangdong, in that very prosperous province next north of Hong Kong, that was started to break out. That got suppressed, but people were demonstrating, saying, we are Hong Kongers. And that's the Chinese nightmare, and that's the Putin nightmare. as the old Cold War era Russian punchline to a joke which has many setups was, "What if the Reds come back?" and the basic setup was basically some communist bureaucrat, even the head guy, was showing off his grandmother, all his riches and what have you, and she said, "Oh, it's very nice, but what if the Reds come back?"
Yeah.
Because with age comes wisdom.
All right. Hey, Dan.
It's time to wrap it up. We'll talk to you gentlemen next time. Bye.
Take care, guys. Bye.